Hello, everyone, and welcome to Determine and Spend Matters webinar, Contract Compliance, Why It Matters to Procurement. My name is Chrissy Rollletter, and I will be your moderator. First, I'd like to start by going over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. The screenshot shows an example of the attendee interface. You should see something like this on your computer in the upper right corner. All attendees are in listen-only mode, and you have joined the presentation using your computer speakers by default. If you prefer to join over the phone, just select phone call, and in the audio pane, the dial-in information will be displayed. You can also submit questions or let us know if you're having any technical difficulties. Determine is a pioneering source-to-pay and enterprise contract lifecycle management company formed in 2015 through the combined expertise of three leading companies across source-to-pay: IASTA in sourcing and supply management, BPAC in procurement, and Selectica in contract management. Our goal is to simplify business complexities so customers can turn pain points into insights and challenges into bottom line results. That's something we do for more than 250 global customers across industries from financial services to pharmaceuticals, healthcare, retail, manufacturing, transportation, and many others. And with that, I'd like to introduce Julian Nadeau, Chief Product Officer, Determine, and Rick Geneva, Product Management, Determine. Jason Bush is also joining us. He's the founder and head of strategy for Azul Partners. Welcome, Jason.
Thanks so much, Chrissy. It's great to be here. Just some super quick background on Azul Partners. Most people know us by our brands, but Azul Partners is the company that runs Spend Matters. So just to call your attention super quickly to a few things. We like to look at procurement on both a global basis, but also a domain basis and a private public sector basis. So chances are you might have heard of Spend Matters, but if you do not know Spend Matters UK, if you do not know our work in the public sector, would encourage you to check out some of our other sites like Public Spend Forum, Spend Matters UK Europe, and if you're in manufacturing, Metal Miner. I think I'm going to kick it off here as we talk about and set the stage about contract management. So I like to overcomplicate presentations and slides sometimes, but the good news is as I work with a number of friends and colleagues who just are much better at distilling information, and my colleague Peter Smith, who runs Spend Matters UK Europe, wrote this slide a few years ago, and I just looked at it and I hit myself because I wanted to say this, but he said it 10 times better than I could ever say it. So if we look at the y-axis here, contract management performance, and the x-axis is procurement performance, the most important takeaway is that even if you have an outstanding procurement performance, let's say you have an amazing sourcing event, let's say you've segmented your tail spend into long, medium, and short tail, even if you've done an amazing job on supplier diversity, doesn't matter what you're looking at in terms of performance. If you have poor contract management performance, even with good procurement on performance, things can go off. But in contrast, we can look at contract management performance, and if things go well and we've done a good job on the procurement piece, it's a success. But even if we've only done an okay job on the procurement side and we've got good contract performance, it can still be a moderate success. So as we think and frame this discussion around contract compliance, around contract management capability, and as we look at different areas we're going to double click on here in a minute, keep this in mind. Contract management really is ultra important, even relative to other areas we typically think about from a buy-side process flow perspective, and the same can be said on the sell side as well. So contract compliance, the basics and why it matters. I'm always after thinking about these little gimmicks. I was never good at memorization when I was younger in school, so I had to come up with different gimmicks. And as I was working with Julian and the team on this webinar, we came up with RISK. So as we think about compliance and the basics, why it matters. So the first area in this word, RISC, is regulatory compliance. So here, if we think about regulatory compliance, suppliers have got to comply with applicable regulations in their industry, and also regs you might deem which are important for your industry as well. So here, it's not just about supplier information management, right? So when we think about supplier onboarding, we think about capturing certifications and capability tied to regulation, but it's also about CLM, because certifications tied to regulation and capability need to stay current for compliance. So if you just onboard a supplier and maybe update the profile information at best once a year, it might not be tied to a given contract. So integration between CLM and SSM is really important here. The next piece here is I, or internal compliance. So if you can just humor me for a minute here and stay with our calculation. So I work with some folks who do a lot around numbers in terms of procurement performance. So if we assume the following, so if we assume that an organization has Maverick spending of 20% non-compliant spending, and we assume, again, using standard procurement numbers, and if anybody would like more detail behind this formula after the webinar, happy to give it to you. And if we assume 75% influence over spend and a 5% missed discount rate, if you add all of this together in a simplified equation, we actually get at roughly 7.5 million in savings per $1 billion of spend. And this also equates to roughly the cost of an average procurement department. So if we do supplier compliance, and specifically if we jump here to internal compliance, we can do a much better job overall at hitting our procurement metrics from a cost and savings perspective. So then supplier compliance, obviously a very important one. If this is on your paper from a CLM standpoint, it can be well automated, especially in a suite like a Determine or others who have got supplier management capability tied to CLM. It's a little bit more complicated if it's on supplier paper, because then you need to tie it back into your contracting process. And there are ways of doing this in the context of counterparty support with MS Word and collaboration as well here. And there are some new things happening moving forward there around auto classification in different areas of CLM in terms of the path forward as well. But there are ways to do it if it's not on your paper. But we also need to keep in mind that supplier contracts are really potentially laden with risk, and there are a lot of potential landmines around it. So you really need to make them explicit and have your system proactively search and watch out for potential non-compliance on the supplier side. Again, tying back to SIM, you've got to have your supplier obligations quantified as well, so that you can't, potentially overstep in a negative way and have penalties or other issues, based around supplier non-compliance. And then obviously we need to consider, rebates and different other things we might have with broader agreements. And then finally, customer compliance. So all of this is ultimately tied to onto what we sell as well. So we need to think about how we can pass regulatory compliance up from customers to suppliers when elements demand that. So, ISO is a great example here. So you should ask the question, to what extent are we extending regulations out to our supplier partners based on what is required of us? In the manufacturing world, especially with contract manufacturing today, this can be even more important. And we'll talk about some industry examples later here. But now I'll flip it over to the Determine team to share some more thoughts as we push forward.
Yeah, so this is Julian, and you made it right, Jason. So it's, we're talking about the global compliance. So global compliance contract is at the center of the compliance. I'm fully agree with you. But at the same time, to be able to capture the global compliance, you have a lot of moving parts, actually. So I'm going to take the example of you want to subcontract something. So you're kind of purchasing services, which is kind of one of the most complex use case. So we're talking about the customer compliance. So the customer compliance, it starts with usually with a project. You have a project to subcontract something, and then you get all the requirements. And the ISO typically is a requirement, right? At the same time, you're going to as well kind of look at the budget. You have some financial money involved. So the compliance is also about making sure that you track, the spend and how much you spend against the budget, right? So the project, the requirement is one of the really big pieces of starting the compliance, because the compliance is against what you decided and what are the, whatever it's a customer, whatever it's your internal regulation or external regulation, you need to gather all the requirements. Then obviously during the, if you do a sourcing event, a request for quote, request for information, RFP, whatever, you have a process where you need to follow internal compliance. So for some industry, it's very big compliance, especially on the public sector. But even in companies, being able to follow the right process is very important. Then it goes into requesting a contract. So you start negotiating about, whether it's an MSA and so on and so on. And all of that is tied, as you say, Jason, to the supplier. So the supplier is a big part of the compliance, obviously, especially on the services, when you buy services. And when you buy services, you need to be very careful on onboarding your supplier, because you need to ask them a lot of questions. And the question actually relates to the requirements you have. So if you're on an ISO 9001 project, you need to make sure that the supplier is certified as well, or you're breaching the compliance or these kind of things. So the onboarding, getting the right information from the supplier, using this supplier in a repository that you can maintain. If you have a certification attached to the way the supplier is involved in your subcontracting, it's very important to maintain the certification, to maintain their information updated, 1099 or whatever. And all of that goes into the contract. And one of the big pieces here is, how do you make sure that the information you collect at the beginning goes through all the process, and you maintain the information from start to end to be able to tell, am I doing the right thing? Do I have the right information? Am I negotiated based on the right information from my supplier? Is my contract, is that related to the right information, and so on and so on. Even on the contract, once you get a contract, there is a piece which is the contract compliance checklist. So even if you have a contract, you have to check that the contract is compliant. So sometimes you want to have a checklist saying, oh, by the way, I'm on the, have a use case about the physician, for example, agreements in the healthcare, and then you need to have a checklist on, is my contract compliant with the regulation, right? And after that, you have all the information about the term sheet provision clause. I'm not going to go into the details. Generated agreement, third-party paper that you can get where you don't have the right information necessarily, so you need to do your job. And then at the end, you need to execute, and you need to execute against what has been defined at the beginning. So if you negotiated a services agreement, for example, you have to make sure that you're in compliance with the agreement, that your subcontractor is in compliance, and so on, up to the point where you go into the payment invoice and the budget tracking, and as well making sure that you audit trail whatever you do, rules, alert, and these kind of things. So that's the way, actually, the platform can help any organization being compliant from start to end.
This is Rick Geneva. I'm going to talk a little bit about the 3 stages of contract compliance a little bit. Julian laid it out pretty well. What are all the big steps and all the major pieces and components that come together. What we see a lot in the industry about how to turn this into a reproducible, successful business process is breaking it down into phases and making sure that you have what you need before you enter into the next phase. For example, the information gathering would include capturing metadata, bringing everything together into a single source of truth, and using a rule system to guide users through the process, self-service, etc. And we typically call that a contract request process. We use a request process as a best practice that we've learned from multiple customers over about a decade of working in contract management, that we are able to collect a lot of information, make sure we have it in advance before we have to keep going back and forth and collecting that later, because this sort of leads to a communication breakdown that would lead to lack of compliance and making concessions within the collaboration and negotiation process, that if you had the information in advance, then maybe you would have gone a little bit different way. So then that gets into comparing agreements with master agreements that are already in effect. And that's actually a lot of times we see duplicated master agreements that sometimes have conflicting terms, or just kickbacks and coupons and things like that that are just completely overlooked because you have actually multiple master agreements in place. A contract review process, so Julian talked about the certification and the questionnaires that actually happen during a sourcing event, It's more common these days to see those actually being included into a contract as a legal document that you're saying, yes, we agree with all the terms in here and we're in compliance. So then that feeds downstream into active management. We usually call that more of the downstream side in the contract world, which means a contract has been signed, executed, it is active in the system, enters a phase of active management. So we're looking for key deliverables, assess how amendments and subcontracts are affecting the overall picture and how the legal clauses and things like that roll up to a master agreement, as well as recurring certifications that happen. You know, you're certifying a supplier, and that has to be done every 90 days or 120 days or something like that. And finally, comparing the contracts portfolio against the regulatory changes in the industry, which happens pretty regularly. So the risks that you're really looking for here is counterparty relationship, internal and external rating, you know, supplier profile management, SIM, supplier information management ties into there, but more often these days, we're actually seeing that as an integral part of contract management, not just supplier management. You know, in the CLM world, it used to be just all about the contract, and the supplier world was all about the supplier. But we're actually seeing so much of what we do these days. Even, you know, customers that were only doing CLM would frequently modify their system to be doing things which are really traditionally a supplier management. So we're seeing counterparty relationship as a big part of it. The document source in the contract, is it third-party paper, internal generated? Is it coming from other trusted systems and that sort of thing? And then also the modification state, is it in the original format, or has it, you know, are you using approved alternatives? And then finally, how heavily negotiated is it?
Great, thanks. I'll pick up from here. So who needs to be involved in contract compliance? Let me think about a different way of restating this and framing it for a minute. So we could just say, hey, you know, procurement needs to be involved in some areas. Legal does. But I think more important than that, we should think about the different types of compliance risks. And then we can back into who should be involved and why. It's much easier if we have some examples. So if we consider brand risk for example to start, you know, we need to ensure that suppliers are complying with key regulations, like an ethics regulation, which are spelled out in a contract. Makes sense for procurement. Quality risk. So we need to make sure that we're adhering, our suppliers are adhering to quality levels spelled out in a contract. But also specific capability scores, which go back. So if you're in the automotive industry, we know the first article testing or PPAP process is very important. It can be important in other industries as well. We also need to think about tier 2 risk. So how does the supplier extend its compliance requirements into its own supply base? And a number of regulations actually spell this out. This has got to be in the contract. But if it's not in the contract, it becomes very difficult to enforce, even if we have a multi-tier SIM onboarding system for supplier data. From a legal standpoint, you know, we've got to think about how do we avoid risk like force majeure, and also price majeure and IP risk. So we need to think about dealing with acts of God, natural hazard risk, and ensuring that a supplier is implementing a proper risk management system. We also need to think about how contract enforcement is clear within different jurisdictions based on a strong rule of law. So really, any KPI that's worth protecting in your supplier scorecard, you know, take cost, quality, or flexibility, should be protected. And real protection is about a contract. So having said that, you know, who should be involved and why? Obviously, for a lot of these areas, you know, the natural risk owners in the business, right? So the business stakeholders who will feel the pain. We also need to think about the day-to-day participants as well who are involved in the active management of the contract. Procurement is absolutely a key piece here too. So, you know, those in the trenches. And there are a number of folks, right? So category managers, supplier managers. And of course, if we have formal contract administrators and contract managers within procurement, they should be involved too. If we're a larger organization, or we are mid-size and more sophisticated, you know, we might have moved to a center of excellence model from a contract standpoint, where we have, you know, a contract capability tied to a COE, most likely on a global basis for support. And then legal obviously needs to be involved throughout too. And legal can be involved in terms of significant upfront effort, but then on an ongoing process, and certainly if there's disputes and remedies required as well. And this is key, and one of the reasons I was so excited to do this webinar, we need to involve our suppliers and partners. When contract management becomes simply legal, simply procurement, and it doesn't extend to suppliers and partners, and it doesn't extend through the activities we're involved with every day from a supplier management standpoint, we're going to be a lot less effective. So I will pass it back now to the Determine team.
Yeah, so again, I mean, we have a lot of people involved. As Rick said, we have a lot of use case from customer in many verticals. What we have seen is the vertical, the business in which our customer are makes a huge difference actually. So we tend to kind of differentiate the different type of business. And actually, when you manage the compliance, you have to manage it by vertical, including managing what we call the contract family. So the information is tied to the type of contract, which is tied to the industry.
We used to build out systems when we were consulting with our customers maybe a half a decade ago that would have what we called business objects, which are kind of siloing actually different contract types. And what we've seen more and more of a trend is that we look at a global portfolio of contracts as a holistic portfolio for a business unit, and it goes in multiple areas. Like we talk about food certification as part of the supply chain. There's international, there's transportation, there's packaging, there's labor laws, and this all really comes together to look at what is the total risk within the portfolio, where are some of the gaps in the compliance, and what's the risk to my business. Is there any other?
Yeah, and we have a pretty interesting use case that came yesterday from one of the customer actually in the retail, and they are pushing kind of a new line of item in stores, and this line of item, which is more related to sustainable, they require a lot of certification, these kind of things. So what they are looking at is not only compliance at the vendor, the supplier, or the contract level, they are looking at the compliance at the item level. So meaning that they want to run certification rules, making sure that they have all the certificates for each item they are going to resell. So it can go pretty deep, and you know that all regulation in this space is moving fast, a lot of risk, especially on the retail. And so it's a very interesting area where we have a lot of business case and use case. We cannot go in detail here, but it's pretty interesting.
One more point on that is the international concerns on it. When you talk about global compliance and extended supply chains and international, globalization, that sort of thing. Well, you think about the risk of regulatory compliance changing within one country, but what if it's 20 countries, 50 countries? Then there's a lot to manage there, and being able to very quickly spot across your contract portfolio to see where those risks are, that could be the difference between success and failure.
Yeah, maybe another use case. We see a lot of things happening. Next slide, please. We see a lot of things happening in the healthcare industry. So you know that healthcare is highly regulated in the US. So the healthcare industry is highly regulated in the US, but also, I mean, in all countries actually. There is a lot of federal, Medicare money involved. So a lot of regulation that are very tight to not only the contractual agreements, but also the execution, even the financial piece of it. And so we see a lot of different use cases where, without having actually a system that can manage the complete compliance, and not only the HR on one piece, the vendor on the other piece, the execution, being able to have a portfolio of all the contracts with all the execution of the contract, all the information for healthcare company is key critical, and there is a lot of financial risk associated to that, as you can think of.
Yeah, a lot of things that we see, particularly in the U.S. market, we have healthcare organizations that are actually outsourcing some of the practices, some of the specialties like cardiology or pediatrics or oncology. And when you do that, you're bringing a lot of compliance risk along with you because they are effectively working on your behalf. And then there's also the number of hours and the regulatory compliance on how many hours are they allowed to work, what's the minimum, maximum. So everything that you see in the individual physician agreements is multiplied by that entire practice that you bring on board. Industry regulations and laws, there's privacy, of course, but there's also things like radiology, handling of hazardous materials in the medical industry. What about radioactive materials and things like that? There's a lot that goes into the overall picture behind the supply chain and handling materials. And one thing that we see very active right now in North America, as well as extending out beyond that, is real estate in the healthcare industry. Because the contractors and the maintenance, janitorial staff, security, all of these people, they're near patients, and if they're interacting with patients or patient records, then there's special certifications and compliance that has to carry all the way through them as well as your normal staff. So.
Yeah, and you can extend that actually. So we're talking about healthcare, but we have use case, for example, of a customer working for the nuclear industry. And again, they subcontract as well, and they have to make sure that the subcontractor going into nuclear power plants, they have to follow a lot of regulation. The same for, we have pretty big customer in the technology and in the cloud business, data centers. And there is a lot of things in terms of compliance as well. Who has the right to enter in the facilities? How are you going to build them, on which compliance? So it's about the same kind of logic behind the scene on the platform, but the use case and the industry makes a big difference actually.
Yeah, and that's a good point that we didn't even put, we couldn't fit it all on one slide actually, so we had to fit some of the parts. But when you look at the IT that goes behind the healthcare industry, it's very data-centric industry, and all the certification for everybody who potentially has access to medical records also comes into play.
But to reassure, we have a bunch of very easy use cases as well that can be very easy to manage in most industry as well. But Jason, maybe for the next one?
Yeah, I'll take it from here. I think the industry examples are really critical. I want to talk a little bit about the complexity of different stakeholders, both from a relationship standpoint with the business and with our suppliers and with our customers, but also from a functional set of areas too, which cross different folks within an organization and different folks who are third parties who are our organization. So at its foundation, a contract is a system of commitment, right? So we know a contract must track legal commitments in the form of legal obligations, which are based on local statutes and laws. But a commitment via contract can be bigger than that. So a commitment can be tied to non-statutory requirements. So it can be tied to performance or service levels. So for a services contract, it could be a service level agreement. So a contract can also be used to give other targets more teeth. So if we look at all these areas here, in the case of supplier scorecards, from a supplier performance standpoint, you want to actually have those roll up from service levels set within a contract in SOW rather than having a supplier scorecard be disconnected from the contract itself. So, contracts are really a way to bind other sets of commitments across all of these areas. If we think about a contract commitment as well, it's really representative of all these enterprise and cross-enterprise processes and initiatives. So contracts are a way, and contract compliance specifically, is a way of making those commitments explicit and commercial. So, we can think about what all these areas are. So supply chain on the slide, GRC, design engineering from a manufacturing standpoint, quality, risk management outside of GRC. So all of these areas are really important as we think about how contracts bridge commitments overall. I was catching up with a friend watching my favorite baseball team in the National League lose last week. You can probably guess who that is, given that I'm based in Chicago, who is a contracts attorney. And I was actually just talking to him as we were getting slaughtered in the game about how contracts are so important outside of legal agreements and frameworks. And he never thought of it that way, but actually talking to attorneys, approaching contract management compliance from a non-legal standpoint really changes your perspective, because the legal part is almost the easy part. It's the broader organizational part in terms of how they bridge commitments. So I'll pass it back to Julian and Rick.
Yeah, so I mean, we'll need to say, by the way, you know, and your slide is very comprehensive, Jason. That looks pretty complicated, right? Looks like, wow, what the hell? I mean, how are we going to manage all of that, right? When you talk about all these use cases and what you need to do if you want to manage the global compliance. So what we tend to say is, when you have actually a platform that has been built for that, and where you can centralize all the information and have a kind of a flow going from start to finish, where you kind of reuse the same information, you manage the information life cycle, and you are able actually to put the contract kind of at the center of that. The contract meaning not only the Word document, but you know, the metadata associated to the documents, the term sheet associated to the contracts, and the execution of that. It makes things much, much easier. So again, the complexity of compliance, we're all aware of all the use case. It's pretty complex, especially if you want to follow all the regulations, whether it's your own internal regulation or the external regulation in each country. But at the end, I mean, having a platform that can collect, gather, and give you all the information about all your contract and how you execute, how you negotiated that, and so on, makes things much, much easier. So I just wanted to say, it's not that complex, actually, if you have the right tool.
Perfect. So why should all of this matter, especially to a CPO? You know, ultimately, you know, we can take this up even further that, you know, the CPOs, you know what is on the line if there isn't compliance, but from the procurement guy in me, and the procurement guy or gal in all of us, we can think about numbers as well, right? So let's quantify it. So, you know, we can think about discounts and reduce missing discounts from contracts, you know, from clauses we're not taking advantage of on the discount side. We can think about missed sourcing opportunities because we don't have good proactive contract information on upcoming renewals, or different opportunities like demand aggregation. We can think about cost avoidance from a non-compliance standpoint with our suppliers, which might involve penalties for us. We can think about, you know, non-compliance, which could impact our operations and revenue and brand. Anybody in the food or CPG business knows, you know, the various standards that the big box stores expect. And if we don't meet those standards in terms of on-time performance because of our suppliers and their non-compliance, we are on the line for that. We can think about improving process efficiencies, reducing legal costs, avoiding fines, reducing FTEs for lots of different work areas. But why does all of this matter? So let's boil it up for a CPO. So a lack of spend visibility, right? A lack of detail into what we're spending makes a CPO mad. But a lack of contract visibility should actually make the CPO's boss, whether that is the CFO or whether a CPO is reporting to the up through board level executives, you know, at the CEO level, it should make them afraid, because contracts are critical vehicles for partner incentives and risk mitigation, but they're also a lot more. So if we don't have contract visibility and we don't know what is happening with our third parties, we have serious risk, not only within our inbound supply chain, but our outbound supply chain too. But more than that, you know, we can think about how contracts can help us align, you know, with legal and expose the problems which are not aligned. So procurement is often accused in lots of organizations of being off to the side. You know, commercial organizations on the sales side are often accused of being somewhat renegade. But CLM is really an effective way of driving alignment and really breaching legal and finance into the operational side, whether it's buy side or sell side. And contracts also lock in who is addressing or treating the risks or not. So the cost of not addressing risks is real. If we can begin to quantify that further up before the contract process, we can actually draft better agreements in the first place, and then we can monitor and enforce them more effectively We can also make sure, and this is a classic procurement argument here, we can also make sure the low-cost risk treater owns that risk, or else we can arbitrage that risk, right? So an example of arbitrage, might be, currency or different types of agreements on a global basis. There's ways of arbitraging risk in terms of transshipment and different types of orders from Asia to the U.S., which has become common in manufacturing because of U.S. trade laws. It's not skirting the system; it's legally addressing something. So we can make sure that the right party to own a risk based on their cost assumes the ownership of that risk, and we can also think about arbitrage. But to do that, we've got to address things effectively. So I talked about some of these already here in terms of quantifying compliance. But overall, one thing I really want to draw your attention to is process efficiencies and lowering legal costs through guided contracting. So there's really no way today, if we go past kind of our Pareto principle and our top suppliers, to pick on the buy side for a minute here, that we can effectively address the mid-tail of suppliers, let alone the long tail who we have agreements with. So we need to get much better at guidance, and guidance within the context of baking in what is okay with our internal counsel or external counsel in certain cases, depending on how strategic an agreement is and what type of expertise we have in-house to address it, to really guide folks within the business to use the right clause levels, clause types, and really tie that ideally even into a sourcing and supplier management process as well. We also need to think too about how we can get more active and predictive around analytics tied to contracts and alerts. One thing which I think is really important here to address, it's not a subject of this webinar, but it's really the future of tying together spending analytics, and you could also say customer analytics as well, tied to contract analytics. It's something which has not been overly well done, but it's something with a procurement suite that you can really do effectively on the buy side, because you've got all the transactional exhaust from a P2P environment, for example. You've got obviously detailed data you're tracking in terms of spending outside of P2P, right? So it might be coming from a T&E system. It might be coming from ERP, MRP in terms of direct spend, and we can all begin to tie that together and look back on the contract side. So anyway, there's lots of ways of thinking about quantifying the opportunity. Today, we can really look at it in terms of hard dollars in some of the areas I talked about a few minutes ago, but we can also begin to look ahead in terms of delivering better contracts and outcomes as well. And we can build return on investment models around that. It's very possible to do so. So I will flip it back to Julian and Rick now.
Yeah, and we are going to talk a little bit about how the technology and what's coming in the technology is going to help us managing better the compliance. So everybody knows that there are a lot of things going on right now. It's a very, very interesting time. We have a combination of technology that are coming into the market that will make our life much, much easier in terms of how can we figure it out in terms of compliance overall for my company. It's a lot of information to be processed. It's a lot of regulation everywhere. And doing that manually is going to be a nightmare. So how can the technology help us? So there is kind of a mix of technology that we have on the market that's going to make a difference in the coming years. The most well-known is what we call the machine learning, deep learning. It's very popular right now, whatever, used by Google, Amazon, Facebook, whatever. And it's something which is really starting to bring a lot of value in terms of crunching information from all this metadata, this data we have, and making value out of it. If you combine that with what we call chatbots, conversational assistants, that means that soon you're going to be able to say, oh, by the way, instead of having to look at compliance, I'm going to be able to ask questions. Which contract is not compliant with this regulation and these kind of things. and it comes to using what we call cognitive technology. Everybody knows, I guess, IBM Watson. It has been pretty famous. And I spent an overseas flight, by the way, with the CTO of IBM in charge of Watson. He told me so many stories about, especially in healthcare, finance, the way Watson was being able to analyze a bunch of contracts, a bunch of legal information, and the fact that you could ask questions about it. And it's fascinating, I mean, what you can do with this technology and what's going to bring to the market, actually. So the combination of machine learning, cognitive, chatbot is going to make our life easier. At the same time, in terms of automation, we have what we call the robotic process automation. So it's really about how do we automate the process, not having to do everything manually on the system. So having a platform is nice, but what about if the system can take actions automatically based on the information it has, based on the analysis it does out of the data he has, and start executing, actually, maybe asking for approval, maybe asking for validation for users. But there is a lot of things that can be fully automated in the system without having to have a user being able to do something. And I guess everybody knows that compliance or non-compliance usually is due to, you know, I didn't have the time to look at it, to do my job, or to renew a contract at the right time. So receiving an alert is fine, but sometimes you need a little more than that. And as well, another technology which is very promising is based on blockchain. It's called the smart contract. And the smart contract, actually, it's really about being able to automate the execution of a contract. So right now, it can work on very simplified use case, like sending a PO and being able to address a PO modification and payment of the invoice related to the PO. But it's really about enforcing terms between entities without the need of a third party. That's very, very interesting, meaning that you don't need to have a trustee party. You can have a direct relationship between two parties, and you can have smart contract, actually, making sure that the agreement is executed against strict rules and consequences. So that's very interesting use case. And if you combine all of that together, you can see that in the next 3 years, you're going to have a lot of things to use to be able to go much, much deeper into the global compliance. Maybe Rick, you want to add something?
Yeah, from a productization perspective on this, what we really look at is, if you remember the previous slide, that we talked about the 3 different phases of the information gathering and in the collaboration phase, et cetera. These different technologies apply to different phases of how we see the world and how the information comes together, how you negotiate a contract, and then how you do active contract management after something is live in the system. And to make all of these technologies work, you really have to go through those 3 phases that we've built into our systems, and how we advise our customers to set up their software to allow them to actually take advantage of this type of technology. So it's really about bringing all the data together and putting it in the right place and plugging it into these types of technologies that will help you as you move forward.
Yeah, in this case, you go to the next level. But even if you have to load a document on the platform and you didn't go through all the process of making the agreement or having the right information, you can still use this technology actually to discover all the information from a contract, get the meaning, get the risk information out of a contract, and feed the metadata we have on the platform. So it works for both ways, but I agree, if you want to take advantage really about this technology, it's better to have the information in the first place.
Yeah, it's virtually impossible to bring all of these technologies together on your own, and that's really the power of the platform and what we're bringing to the market, is just being able to turn on the options that you need.
Yeah, maybe Jason, you want to add something?
I think we're approaching the top of the hour here. But one thing I would say, you guys hinted at this. I think as the world transforms itself outside of our little procurement and commercial and legal silos, as we think about the Internet of Things, for example, So, really thinking about, how contracts could be tied to physical assets or sensors or digital assets. I think the notion of blockchain, and anybody who says blockchain is 10 years out is smoking something today. I was at a meeting last week with Jose Arrieta, who is in procurement at the GSA. The GSA in the US is not exactly known, for being avant-garde. The GSA has a working blockchain implementation in procurement. It's one of the first in government I've seen in the US and one of the first in private sector. So blockchain is real. So I would just encourage you to think about not how these technologies will necessarily drive better CLM alone, but how you will need to do better CLM leveraging them, because the world outside is changing and it's going to touch us. That's probably a good place to summarize and kind of go back to basics for a second. The world outside is changing fast, technology is changing, but let's not forget about the basics. So how do we drive performance and contain risk? Have a couple basic goals here. I'll try and end here in the next minute, and then we can, get the final word from Rick and Julian and do some questions. But, the goal, very basic, full visibility into all contracts with the required level of metadata structured in a commonly accessible format, ideally integrated with other software areas. So how do we do this? We need completeness. We need a view across repositories and silos. We need to accurately capture the metadata with associated contracts and other data associated not only as part of a CLM system, but as part of sourcing, of SIM, of P2P. We need to manage storage and access levels. And we need to make sure, at least if we pick on the buy side here again, that our systems are talking to each other. So those are the basics. We could talk more about, hey, well, what is the higher level? I'm very excited as we talk about how we extend CLM into other enterprise processes. You saw that eye chart of the slide around supply chain, GRC, and inventory, you name it, how we get into predictive models. But the basics are still there, and the truth is that most organizations have not achieved the basics yet. So let's be realistic in terms of our long-term goals, but let's start pragmatically today. Rick and Julian, anything else to add?
No, I think you wrapped it up. So I guess it's time for maybe a few questions.
Yeah, thank you, Julian, Rick, and Jason. And we do have a few questions from our attendees. The first one is from Jack. He says, we manage contracts in SharePoint and suppliers in Excel across the organization. Is achieving the level of compliance you reference even possible in this case?
Go ahead, Jason.
Yeah.
I can repeat it as well. So essentially the question comes down to, you're managing, contracts within a SharePoint environment, and you're managing procurement within Excel. I think, unfortunately, an insane amount of procurement processes are still managed within Excel today, even organizations which have sourcing, supplier management tools. But I think it will be very difficult to achieve this type of visibility and compliance we're talking about, if you're relying on our favorite company in Redmond as your foundation overall. But Julian, would love to hear what you have to say.
Well, we actually deal with a lot of customers that started out in, unfortunately, some of them are kind of a victim of their own customization of SharePoint. I can think of at least 2 customers off the top of my head in the last year alone that have spent many months customizing SharePoint, putting a lot of fields in there, and a field for this and a field for that and a field for that, and a field for, did I comply with union labor laws, and who knows what it is. What we find, though, is that when you have a broader exposure to the industry and understanding what the master data really needs to look like and design it for best industry practices, such as, is that really a certification question? Is that a compliance question? Or is it really a metadata question? Or is it about provisions that are in the contract? And the way that you organize those is really what dictates the success or failure of that system that you spend a lot of time customizing. So it's not necessarily the fact that SharePoint is or isn't a really good tool. It's just the fact that to be honest with you, it's kind of homegrown, and we are looking at it from a perspective that we have, many years of collective experience in the industry, where we've designed systems that capture the essence of what you really need to do and bring it in a way that can help you find the information that you need quickly. And it's not just for the legal team. We build systems that are for the larger, to get business done. That it's focusing on the business community more so on the legal community.
Okay, let's see. I think we have a few more minutes. Let's do one more. Comes from Jeffrey. In retail, you mentioned seeing beyond individual contracts as a key to understanding risk. Can you elaborate on that some more?
Go ahead, Rick.
I mentioned something about this earlier about the contract portfolio management, and the contract portfolio in itself actually has, you could almost say that you could assess a value on it based on how much risk that you've accumulated. What we tend to look at is the relationship with the third parties, not only what we consider suppliers, but other third parties, thinking about, you have contract employment. Procurement is a really big aspect of it, and something that we've been focusing on a lot. We're hearing a lot more of it in the industry today, as well as things like program management, which is multiple contracts, multiple projects that are all really tied together in a larger kind of a program of, you have a portfolio of contracts underneath there, and you have multiple concurrent programs that are running. Basically, business is getting better. Business is getting bigger. There's more complexity and more moving parts. And being that contract management is a really big part of that, as well as supplier management, all that information is being put into systems now. And so what we really look at is what is the relationship of all those contracts, and what kind of cumulative risk are you taking on, and where are the weak links. So that's kind of, I don't want to make it sound scary like you have to do data analytics, but that's really what we're focusing on as we build out our software to make it pretty easy just at a glance to understand what's the risk level and what's the compliance and where are your weak spots.
Yeah, and that can be seen as a hierarchy, right? Hierarchy of different things, whether it's a different level of contract, of supplier, contractor, regulations, kind of thing. So it's kind of pretty big tree at the end, hierarchy. And you can get a lot of different things in this hierarchy to be able to go back to the line item at the end if you need to.
Okay, I just want to thank everyone for their questions, and for everyone for attending. Thank you, Jason, Julian, and Rick, for your time. And if we did not get to your questions, we will definitely answer those by email. And you can see on the screen the emails of Jason, Julian, and Rick if you need to contact them. Also, we will let you know when the webinar is available on demand, and you'll also be able to get the presentation at that time. So again, thank you everyone for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.